We've been looking at the week that changed your life. We started with the Friday before the week that changed your life when we read the story about the woman who anointed the feet of Jesus with her hair, with the oil, and then wiped it off with her hair. Beautiful, beautiful story. The next week we talked about the fig tree. That was on the Sunday of the week that changed our life. And then Monday was the cleansing of the temple. And Tuesday was, we had 2 weeks devoted to Tuesday, just some teaching of Jesus in his last week of life. And now today we are on Thursday. I know it's Sunday, but we're talking about Thursday. And we're talking about Thursday evening, which Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. That's what we want to get to today. So in your Bibles, you'll just have to follow me as I go on. Chapter 14 in verse 12, we read this. On the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread, which would have been that Thursday, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Now, this is the first time, in my understanding, that the disciples have tried to get ahead of Jesus. The whole Gospels long, they are responding to the things he needs. And sometimes slowly, sometimes, in a confused way. But here they probably get together and they say, let's see if we can handle the accommodations for the master even before he asks the question. So they come to him and they say, okay, we know you're a rabbi. We know that you're going to eat the Passover with the disciples. What would you like us to do? What would you like us to go and prepare? May we go somewhere? And what they find out is Jesus has already thought of it. In fact, he has set the whole thing up. Listen to what he says. So he sent two disciples telling them, listen, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water, which Jesus had set up. Okay, Jesus had set this thing up the way he set up the untied, or the colt that was tied up in Bethphage. Set up the same thing. Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, the teacher asks, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Jesus has already reserved a room. Do you see that? He will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there. The one time that the disciples think that they might be able to get ahead of Jesus and sort of steer it themselves for just a moment, Jesus said, I've already thought of it. I've got it covered. I've already made arrangements. Follow the guy with a jar. He'll take you to the house. Go into that house. Talk to the owner. Say, we're ready. Now, do you believe me now? After 5 weeks, I've been talking to you about the same theme over and over and over again. Do you believe me when I say that this is not some sloppy coincidence of what's going on here in Jerusalem? Do you believe me that this is not some tragic accident? A train wreck that was just on its way and just happened to happen, and Jesus was in the middle of it, and how tragic it is? Do you believe me now when I say that Jesus synced his calendar to the calendar of the ancient feast of the Passover so that he would be in exactly the same place and the city as a tradition to celebrate a tradition that was 1,400 years old then and now 3,500 years old? Do you believe me that the whole thing was orchestrated? That Jesus is setting the whole thing up to prove a single point, to communicate in the most powerful way imaginable a truth that after today you will never forget. It took him 9 months to go 40 miles. On the top of the Transfiguration, On the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus met with Elijah and Moses. You remember there's sort of a cloud all the way around. Peter, James, and John, they see it. They report on it. Later on, even Peter testifies to it that we saw Jesus on the holy mountain. And what they see Jesus do is talking to Moses and Elijah. And Luke, the Gospel Luke, tells us what they're talking about. The Gospel Luke tells us they're talking about the Exodus, the exit plan for Jesus. And the reason Moses and Elijah are up there is because they had unique exit plans. Moses walked up Mount Nebo and was never heard or seen from since. He never entered the promised land. He was up there at Mount Nebo. He had great eyes, the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us he had strong knees, and then he died. But he was never buried. Moses was never buried. Elijah was assumed into heaven. So these two figures, the law and the prophets, are up on this mountain. They're talking to Jesus, and they say, it's time to go. And Jesus goes straight to Jerusalem, which is only 40 miles, but he takes 9 months to get there because he's got literally 35 stops along the way. Why? Because he's waiting. He's waiting so that he enters the city at just the right time. And then when he's with his disciples in the upper room to observe and celebrate the Passover and link the Passover to his life, it is at just the right time. There is no coincidence here. This is not just a happenstance. This is not a tragic accident. This scenario I'm going to describe to you was set up before the foundations of the world. Now, to understand it, we have to go back in time. Not to 2,000 years where Jesus lived, or when Jesus lived, but to the year 1446 BC, when Moses was 80 years old. And he's tending sheep east of Midian. And he sees this burning bush. And he goes to the burning bush and takes off of his shoes. You know the story. And the burning bush says, go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. The ancient Hebrews, let my people go. Moses had a unique ability to do that because Moses was a Hebrew. He was a Hebrew baby rescued out of the river by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in Pharaoh's court. He had the access key. Moses had the ability to go right to Pharaoh. So Moses goes to Pharaoh, and with Aaron, they speak to Pharaoh, and they say these words, let my people go. And Pharaoh, you know the story, says no, yes and no, and yes and no, and yes and no. And the plagues start to come on everybody. And finally, at the end, the 10th plague, God says, look, something terrible is going to happen. The angel of death is going to come by, and he's going to wipe out the firstborn male child across the land and the firstborn cattle across the land. And tell your people, God says to Moses, tell your people to take a lamb, a fresh, new baby lamb, and sacrifice that lamb, and take the blood of that lamb and smear it on the doorposts of their homes, on the lintel of their home, and on the doorposts of their home. And when the angel of death, do you watch Lost? This is the smoke monster, okay? I've got it all figured out in my mind, okay? Everything came into focus this last week. But when the angel of death, the smoke monster, comes and takes care of all the sadly, all the children there in Egypt, he will pass over those homes where the blood is covering the doorstep, the doors. And Moses says, do this, and then take that lamb and eat it in haste. In fact, every year at this time, eat a lamb in haste. And remember that God has provided for you. Remember that God saw you in slavery and pulled you out of it. Remember that God gave you an exit plan. He saw you when you were in need, and He came to you, and He found a way. And we remember this every single year. By the time of Jesus, for 1,400 years, on the same day of Passover, they remembered this amazing story that God provided for them.
We thank you for joining us online. The ministries of Christ Church Plano are made possible by generous contributions from our members and viewers. If you have found this sermon meaningful and would like to make a gift of support, please visit christchurchplano.org/give. Thank you.